Okay, hello everyone. In the next 5 minutes, I'll try and give you a overview of who Wine Australia is and a bit of a insight into the research that we commission and how it may be of interest to you. So I'm a senior R&D program manager, just like my colleague Craig Elliott, and our role is really to guide investment for benefit to the wine sector. So who is Wine Australia? We're one of 15 research development corporations, or RDCs. We're a statutory government authority, and we have three core roles. We coordinate and fund research. So grape growers and winemakers pay a levy. The federal government matches that. And that bucket of money, we invest in projects around R&D, adoption and commercialization. Our total budget is around $40 million, with about a third of that spent on grape and wine production, about 20%, another 20% spent on sustainability-focused research as well. We're also the regulator.
Sorry. Alex, sorry to interrupt, but you're actually sharing the next slide. Yeah, if you could switch it to actually the slides, because we can't read what's on your slides.
Okay.
To go to the display setting at the top, on the top in the middle.
Yeah.
You have to click on that and then swap.
How's that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for that advice. Thanks, everyone. We're also the regulator or the police for wine to make sure that wine's compliant, so we control the export of wine. And we're also a marketer for Brand Australia for wine. So our goal, strangely, under the Act, is to increase consumption of wine both in Australia and overseas. So I'll be talking about the first role, about investment in R&D. We have traditionally had a very diverse R&D portfolio, and this is just a sketch of our investment plan for the current financial year. And historically, we've allocated that funding in blocks, in large blocks, to 5 organisations. Those organisations you can see on the screen: to the Australian Wine Research Institute, the SARDI, UA, CSIRO, and CSU. That's historical, and I'll get to the reason why I'm calling it historical. But what I've done here is, during the discussion today, I've highlighted some of the overlaps. We are currently investing and have invested a lot in optimising water and nutrient use, so sustainability topic. We're currently developing a strategic plan around ESG and sustainability, looking at specifically market access issues. So where are the gaps that Australian wine sector needs to be looking at so that we continue to access global markets and our retailers? And we are halfway through the commissioning of an emissions reduction roadmap for the sector. And I'm also responsible for looking at the gaps around our target of zero waste. So you'll see that there's big headings around grape production, wine production, sustainability, digital data, a big investment in people. My colleague Joe Hargraves, about 12% of our budget's in leadership development. And there's a big portion around ensuring that these research insights get picked up by our grower and winemaker community. And that's actually how we started our relationship with QUT through the Nudgeathon program. We were looking at ways to increase the adoption of the work that we'd invested in terms of sustainability. So very diverse portfolio, and traditionally has been allocated to those 5 research providers. But things have changed. We had a new CEO start 6 or so months ago. He did a listening tour and spoke with more than 100 organisations, or customers as Martin refers to them, nationally. These were face-to-face meetings, typically in all regions. And he has now changed the framework for our investment in R&D and adoption. So we need to, in the future, more co-design with sector-based on market insights, much greater involvement of the regions in what we do. And importantly, given the diversity of projects you just saw, we're looking at fewer and larger projects with greater potential for impact, and looking also at new business models to speed up the adoption. So my history, I've been with Wine Australia for 3 years. I came out of the private sector for a very, very large corporate wine company where I was their manager for their grape production and viticultural management. And my criticism of Wine Australia was that we invested $1 million with them annually in levies, but we saw very little impact. And what our new CEO is doing is responding to industry concerns about needing greater impact through these points that are listed on the screen at the moment. And already in the first 6 months of Martin's tenure at Wine Australia, he's changed the way we do business. And the first cabs off the rank, if you like, are co-design projects around these 4 topics, 2 of which have already kicked off. So the first one is what we call NOLO, or no and low alcohol wine. So there's a market opportunity around this market segment for lower or no alcohol wines. And my colleague, Paul Smith, is doing a very in-depth co-design process at the moment across the value chain, looking at the design for a no and low alcohol project. We've just launched a similar project under the premise of wine production and quality with our main research partner in this area, which is the Australian Wine Research Institute. We are yet to touch on the other 2 topics that I've listed there, sustainability and grapevine breeding. And I'll talk about grapevine breeding in a minute. But sustainability is a big priority for us. I've mentioned that we're just halfway through a emissions reduction roadmap. We've got a national sustainability framework and program called Sustainable Wine Growing Australia. We're investing heavily in determining what our markets want in terms of sustainability metrics, whether it's around biodiversity, carbon, waste, what are their priorities? So we're asking those questions of our global markets and looking at things that were mentioned previously around the EU farm to fork and requirements in other markets. So sustainability is a priority, and we haven't quite touched that yet. And that's one of the next things that we'll be co-designing. But in the remaining couple of minutes, I just wanted to talk about some of the challenges that we're looking at under the heading initially of zero waste. So one of the issues that I'm looking at is the recovery and reuse of posts from vineyards. So in a vineyard, you will have trellis posts. Across Australia, the majority of these posts are CCA treated, copper chromium arsenate posts or permapine. They have a life of about 25 years. And at their end of life, there's no reuse opportunity for them at the moment. We're looking at a project currently with a forestry industry and University of the Sunshine Coast. But one of the issues we've got, until there is a reuse opportunity for these posts, until there is a commercial and viable way of recovering and reusing these posts, we need to, as Stephen said, reduce the unintentional non-compliance by growers. So growers stockpile these posts, and sometimes they may accidentally be burnt, because they don't realize that they're not meant to. They don't realize of the hazards and safety issues around their burning, or they may not be stored in a way that minimizes the impact to the environment. So that's something that I'm intending to look at. How do we send a message to our grower communities that in the future there may be a way of recovering and reusing these posts, but until that occurs, please store these posts appropriately and minimize the unintentional non-compliance. In the image, you can also see a picture of old dripper tube. Fortunately, there are avenues for the disposal, for the recovery and disposal and recycling of dripper tube, but it gets back to the logistics pathways. And that's one of the points that I made in the chat around biochar. There's a lot of potential for some of these opportunities, but logistics often gets in the way of the potential for the farmer. So I'll just wrap up with one more example of one of the challenges we've got. We invested heavily with CSIRO, and CSIRO also invested heavily in this project over the past 15 years to address one of the biggest challenges that grape growers have, namely around the need to spray fungicides to prevent two diseases, downy mildew and powdery mildew. CSIRO used non-GMO technology, but fast breeding, if you like, to develop 400 grape variety selections that are resistant to these two key diseases that we have globally in grapevines. The unfortunate issue is that you can't call them Chardonnay or Riesling or Shiraz because they're not identical to those varieties. They have been bred, and so they are slightly different to the traditional varieties. And because the wine sector is a fashion industry, people want the traditional variety names, and we're seeing resistance in the adoption of these varieties, even though in blind tastings, people prefer these new varieties to some of the traditional varieties when you do these tasting events. So one of the challenges we've invested multi-million dollars in the development of these disease-resistant varieties. However, there's resistance among the wine sector, amongst the wineries in their adoption. So look, I'll leave it there, given time. Always open for a chat like Val, and they're my details on the screen. But I hope I've just given you a taste of some of the projects that we're involved with, the overlap with what QUT is interested in the sustainability, behavioural economic space, and in the waste space. And Craig Elliott and my other colleagues and I also have an open door policy. So thank you for the opportunity.